And so there's a very broad consensus that to have an effective Western liberal democracy, there is a set of things that people need to have at their fingertips that they can deploy no matter what it is that they do. Mm-hmm. Now, the authoritarian would not like many of those tools. To have a society of reasoned, systematic thinkers may make support for some less than effective policies much more difficult. When you have highly credentialed, intelligent, well-meaning people who simply are uneducated. They have all the degrees, but they don't have systems thinking. They can't see 2 steps ahead. They don't understand what are the effects of their decisions or indecisions. Then the population will lose faith. I think fundamentally, we've redefined what the concept of education is. In almost every university in the world, including some that are ranked below us, but very close to us, the concept of education is very simply, can I demonstrate at a point in time that I've crammed enough information and I have it in short-term memory to be able to pass a test?
And then forget it.
And then forget it immediately.
Inconformes. This episode was recorded in English.
Ben Nelson, fundador de Minerva University, ha transformado la educación superior con un modelo que rompe con las aulas tradicionales y forma líderes globales. Graduado en Economía por la Universidad de Pensilvania y creador de Snapfish, Nelson ha dedicado su vida a repensar cómo y para qué aprendemos. Su visión ha inspirado a instituciones en todo el mundo, entre ellas la Universidad de la Libertad, con la que comparte la misión de llevar la educación a un nuevo nivel.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us today at Inconformes.
Huge pleasure to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you at the Universidad de la Libertad. Today, I wanted to talk to you about the role that you have played specifically in what I call the evolution of higher education. But before we actually get into the details of higher education and what that evolution looks like, I wanted to ask a bit about why. Why is the evolution of higher education necessary? And we had a conversation in San Francisco not too long ago where we talked about the state of the world. And I find it very ironic that although historically we have evolved into an era where there is an abundance of information, it seems as though there is a lack of judgment. And to me, that's quite a paradox. You know, I remember when the internet was invented and we finally started to use it, and we thought this information revolution is going to create more democratic societies. It's going to liberate us from authoritarian regimes. It's going to foment critical thinking. And, you know, I at least saw it as the dawn of a bigger and better age. And it seems to me that the opposite has happened, right? That we're seeing more authoritarian regimes, that we have more yes men that are chanting slogans and are rewarded for chanting slogans instead of really thinking critically. And I guess for me, and I'd like to ask you, is there a link between our ability to think critically and the formation of new and more democratic and more or societies with just more liberty?
Yeah, very much so. What you have to kind of understand to see why we are where we are today is to go back and understand how the higher education system that we have came into being. And what were the attempts at reform at the time, and how the approaches at reform may have been fit for purpose for that era, but are not fit for purpose anymore. So if you go back all the way to the formation of the Western higher education sector, if you will, about 1,000 years ago, higher education really served one of two purposes. They were either there to serve the cross, I'm going to train you to be a priest, I'm going to train you for the clergy, etc., or they were there to serve the crown. Right? I am a subject, I'm not a free citizen, and therefore I will learn a trade to serve my place in society as I'm subject to the monarch. So I'm either bending the knee to the monarch, bending the knee to the church, and my role is just to make a living, contribute in that specific way. Fast forward to the 18th century and the dawn of a democratic ideal. This is, of course, in the United States, followed later by France, but in the United States, really a thoughtful, philosophical country, not a country that is based on a group of people, a historical legacy. It really is a country that's based on a philosophy, a set of laws, a set of ideals. And core to those ideals were this concept of going back and creating a republic modeled after the Roman Republic of the 1700 years earlier. And in the Roman Republic, there was this concept that was resurrected by Benjamin Franklin and later adopted by Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers, that you wanted to train your citizens to be sovereign, right, to be free, because they're not at the behest of,
That's right.
of a king or of an emperor, even though the Roman Republic was short-lived, but they are to either elect a senator, right, or people in the Senate, or they would themselves serve.
Right.
And so the idea is that sovereignty came with responsibility, and that enfranchised citizens of Rome, now the citizens of this new society in the United States, would have to be able to be skilled or taught in the various disciplines or arts that allowed them to have freedom or liberty. And that was the genealogy of the liberal arts ideal. And at the time, teaching you the various disciplines, this is of course the height of the Enlightenment, the various disciplines that you needed to know was a finite task. There was not only a finite amount that we knew, but there was an agreed upon canon. And therefore, that knowledge basis was digestible. And you could effectively achieve, or at least attempt to achieve, this idea of systems thinkers, people who understand what Franklin referred to as practical knowledge, which Jefferson called useful knowledge, knowledge that they can apply no matter what it is that they're doing. It could be in their chosen career, it could be in switching their career, it could be in voting, it could be in serving. So those core ideas, those core pieces of practical knowledge would be pervasive. And you would be able to effectively abstract them by reading the canon, by understanding the great philosophers, by understanding, and at the time, of course, philosophy was all-encompassing. Philosophy included science, included mathematics. It was really one mega subject. And therefore, rhetoric, of course, right, the ability to use language, and therefore, the idea, which was revolutionary at the time, manifested itself at universities in an evolutionary way, rather by learning information about one field of study.
Correct.
You were to learn a canon across a number of more amorphous fields, or the broader philosophy, and then you would be tooled to pursue your life's goals. Fast forward a couple of hundred years later, and not only does the quantum of information we know go up by orders of magnitude,
Right.
not only do you have the access to that information readily available through the internet, of course now through AI, etc., but the agreement on the canon vanishes, collapses. The idea of saying, I can tell you over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, you must read and know this information, you don't need to know that information, is absurd. It's fanciful. There's no way to be able to have an agreed upon set of information. However, there's without question a core set of tools that, even though it may not be universally agreed upon, it is almost universally agreed upon, some subset of those tools. There's nobody on the planet that thinks that it's a bad idea for a human being to understand the difference between a fact and a claim unless they want to manipulate that person.
Correct.
Right? There's no one in the world that wants people to be ineffective communicators unless they themselves are the ones that want to dominate the conversation. Mm-hmm. There's no one in the world that would imagine you shouldn't understand unintended consequences or second order effects of your actions.
Emergent properties.
Or emergent properties.
Correct.
Unless that person wants you to disregard long-term impact so you would support their very short-term personal gain. And so there's a very broad consensus that to have an effective Western liberal democracy, there is a set of things that people need to have at their fingertips that they can deploy no matter what it is that they do. Mm-hmm. Now, the authoritarian would not like many of those tools. To have a society of reasoned, systematic thinkers may make support for some less than effective policies much more difficult. But, and so there is a little bit of that tension. No one, even the authoritarian, is going to come out and publicly say, I want my citizenry dumb, unable to process information, be able to salute, etc. No one can say that publicly. But we see in the actions of so much of higher education a clinging to this idea that you can perpetuate a perspective, a point of view, as opposed to tool people with the ability to truly think for themselves using effective ways of understanding information.
Right.
Not to think for themselves so they believe in all sorts of fanciful, crazy ideas and say, oh, I'm a free thinker because I believe that invisible elephants run this world, right? It's because you can actually reason and have reasonable disagreements, have different perspectives, but be able to have a common intellectual language through which you can discuss and understand the other person's perspective in looking at things.
So I think there are two very interesting points that you are highlighting that have to do with educational institutions themselves, right? And the one thing I think that is interesting about what you have done in terms of the evolution of higher education is to go from content-based learning to skills-based learning, right? And I guess for me, I have the question, you had a very lucrative, very, very lucrative career in tech. Yeah. And yet you decided to switch gears. You pivoted completely into higher education. What is it that you saw that no one else did? Because when we think about the Minerva project and skills-based learning, I think there are some emergent properties. I don't know if you saw them or not, right? Yeah. But the ability to really think about our students as adults, right. The ability to think about students as individuals with a very specific level of potential, that the institutions were there to nurture that potential, that they're not there to dictate or impose just fields of knowledge, right? Yeah. Or to stand on a podium in an ivory tower and say this is the way things need to be done. Yeah. I don't know if you saw that when you were making that decision, but I'd like to know a little bit about how you made that decision, why you made that decision, and what did you see?
Yeah, when I was in my late teens, I think maybe I was 20 years old by then. I was in university. I got taught a really crucial lesson about philanthropy. I was at Wharton, and we were dedicating a brand new building that was made possible by a $100 million donation by John Huntsman Sr. And John Huntsman came from absolute nothing, abject poverty, and he was a Wharton graduate and decided to really pay back for the school. And during the opening ceremony, he was, of course, mobbed by students. I was in the kind of the receiving committee, but nobody was talking to his wife. And I went up to his wife and I told her, I said, look, I just want to thank you for your generosity. And she looked at me and she said, what generosity? I said, well, you donated $100 million, which at the time was one of the largest gifts in higher education's history, to enable this building. That's incredibly generous. She says, that's not generous. We could afford it. Let me tell you what generosity is. Because when we had 2 kids, they had, I think, 5 eventually, and John, she told me, was working at a chemical factory. He didn't make enough money to pay for our rent, clothing, food, and school supplies for our own children. Didn't have enough money for that. Yet there was a woman that lived down the street whose husband worked at the same chemical factory and died. And she had 3 children and no source of income. And every 2 weeks when John before he came home, he would cash his paycheck and give her a portion of the paycheck before coming home. And she says to me that she was screaming at him and getting into all these fights and saying, how could you do this? You're not supporting your own family. And he said she needs it more than we do. She said if he didn't have that philosophy back then, this building wouldn't be built today. Mm-hmm. And so I had this perspective that should be my role in life. And I went and started donating at that time when I had no ability to donate, and did so ever since. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go and make a bunch of money and then return that money to society by philanthropic contribution and making a difference in that way. And that's what I did throughout my 20s and my early 30s. But at the same time as I had that conversation with her, I had this kind of vision, this idea that I'd been working on as an undergraduate about how to fix higher education, how to basically bring systematic thinking to higher education. And when I was an undergraduate, I just couldn't do anything with it. I tried and failed. And years later, when I was doing very well in my internet career and had a lot of those options, the theory behind why that was important, basically my view of the collapse of Western liberal democracy, and this was back in 2010, and to me, it was clear that these were end times for the old system. And I had a big problem with that, not because I thought the old system was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought that it needed to be reformed through effective educational systems.
But for our viewers, could you expand a little bit more on the end times of the system and what was happening in the landscape that led you to that conclusion?
So there were 2 elements that were catalytic moments for me in that time. One was, strangely enough, in the United States, the nomination of Sarah Palin as the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, nominated by and chosen by John McCain, who was a reasoned. Again, you may agree or disagree with some of his policies, but absolutely
recognized leader,
recognized independent thinker and systems thinker, etc. Yeah. But Sarah Palin, whether you like it or hate it, was a joke. But I both predicted that he would pick her 6 months before he did, and even though that was a pretty aberrant perspective at the time, and my firm belief was that she wasn't an aberration, that she is going to be effectively what will happen in the American political system as it effectively descends into jingoism, populism, etc., and not full reasoned and thoughtful debate. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you had, of course, Obama won the 2008 election. And by every account, Obama was highly educated, very intelligent, and I would even say well-meaning. And his policy decisions were absolutely disastrous. Probably the pinnacle of which was the healthcare policy. Mm-hmm. When Obama assumed office, he had 60 senators, which means in the United States that you had a filibuster-proof or effectively a supermajority. He had control of the House. He had massive popularity. He could have gone in and implemented well-reasoned, thoughtful, effective reforms. And instead, what happened? There was dithering, nothing happened, he lost a supermajority, and a massively compromised bill to expand healthcare, which was very important in the United States, passed, and the pinnacle of which is that the government spent $650 million building a website that didn't work.
Really?
That's correct.
What
$650
website
million
was this?
to build a website for you to sign up for your healthcare program.
Okay.
It did not work for years. It crashed, it wasn't effective.
And you were in technology at the time.
Correct. And it was a project that should have cost $5 million.
Right.
Max. Right.
Today
it would cost about $500,000. And the dichotomy was clear. When you have, and it was true on the left, it was true on the right, it didn't really matter. When you have highly credentialed, intelligent, well-meaning people who simply are uneducated, they have all the degrees, but they don't have systems thinking. They can't see 2 steps ahead. They don't understand what are the effects of their decisions or indecisions. Then the population will lose faith in those leaders, as they should. But what will they turn to?
Yeah.
They'll turn to the empty promises.
Right. You do realize that what you just said is highly controversial.
Yes, because it doesn't countenance either side. But you know what?
No. In terms of education, Ben.
Oh yes, that's also true.
Because we're talking about individuals that, for the most part, were educated, and I'm going to put that in quotes purposefully, in some of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. We're talking MIT, Harvard,
Correct.
Yale, Princeton, and yet, you're talking about their inability, or maybe their lack of skills, to be able to implement the actions that are required in order to solve a problem.
Correct. And look, it's one of the things I know has never occurred at any of these institutions, which is these institutions clearly have a point of view. They clearly want to educate their students to think in certain ways, which I am opposed to, and they would even say they're opposed to. But there are absolutely things that are beyond the pale of almost any perspective. So for example, I don't think any of the Ivy League institutions would be pro January 6th insurrection, which was the storming of the Capitol in the United States.
Correct, yeah.
The 2 leading senators who were effectively proponents of the mob that stormed the Capitol, between them had degrees from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford. These 2 individuals, undergraduate, graduate degrees from those 4 institutions. Mm-hmm. And I guarantee you that there hadn't been a single professor, let alone the university professor, or the university president, the dean, a provost, a committee, a department, that said, my God, how has our education failed those individuals? How did we give them a degree and certify them as thinking people and allow them to be supportive of that action?
Yeah. Yeah.
No one had that conversation. And I think this is ultimately where the emperor has no clothes moment comes, which is that universities have long ago, decades ago, abandoned their role in the formation of humans.
Right.
In shaping not a way for them to think, but a bound, a set of perspectives that will allow them to reject things that are clearly wrong and debate about what is possibly correct.
Right. And I think I've heard you speak about this before. When you talk about creating or forming individuals that are not just critical thinkers, but that are also problem solvers, and that perhaps, there's less ideology, more pragmatism, right? And I think that in many ways at Universidad, Libertad, we have that same philosophy. I think that's why, Minerva University and Universidad, Libertad have worked so well together in their partnership. From your perspective, right, and with regard to this educational model that we share, what are we teaching that is creating that individual that we absolutely need as a citizen to exercise their agency to create better governments and societies and markets?
Yeah, look, I think that the beauty of centering your education on systems of thought really helps elucidate a much narrower set of possibilities that are potentially true. And why is that? If you understand probability, if you understand statistics, if you build intuitions around that, if you understand cause and effect, if you understand the difference between correlation and causality,
yeah.
Right? If you understand the idea of emergent properties, as you've said, where you can implement particular solutions in a system, but those solutions will then in turn create other types of outcomes as they interact with one another, you're then able to see systems in a much clearer way. Two things emerge from that kind of education. First and foremost, certitude goes down. You have much greater certitude on things that are obviously don't work. So you have the ability to analyze and reject silly ideas, which sadly pervade society overwhelmingly. But you're much more measured in your understanding of what to do, both because you understand that nothing is guaranteed. There's probabilistic. There's a likelihood that something will happen versus a likelihood that something different would happen. And because you understand that the complexity and the number of factors that can feed in can significantly change whatever it is that you propose. Mm-hmm. That allows you to actually be able to speak to somebody that has a different solution, but that has that same intellectual tool basis, and be able to compromise, to work together, to perhaps create something even better moving forward. And that is at the essence of a cohesive society. A cohesive society is not something where a leader says something and everybody salutes, right? That's authoritarianism. That is not about free thinking.
Correct.
A cohesive society is one where people disagree, but that they have a way to communicate, to explain their point of view, and to listen to that point of view and understand, wait, I am not certain of my perspective. That person has a reasoned set of principles. There may be something there that will make me better, me more effective,
Correct.
my perspective in richer and stronger. And that is, to me, the essence of what an education is. It's what I believe Libertad represents, right? The ability to have these reasoned, systematic conversations. And the reality is that there are solutions that are much closer to a high likelihood of working than others. And so we know there are a lot of failed ideas that constantly resurrect themselves for whatever political reason, for whatever ahistorical reasons, people who just don't understand history, etc., for whatever wishful thinking, good-natured individuals that want to promote an idea that does not really comport with the way that human beings behave, who don't understand behavioral science, etc. And to be able to be grounded in the empirical evidence, to be able to be grounded in the understanding of cause and effect, etc., can shift the conversation away from fanciful thinking into practical thinking and understanding what it is that we can get done.
Correct. And I wanted to ask, when we talk about, yes, we talk about this difference in teaching based on content and then teaching based on skills. But it seems to me that you are also pointing to a difference in the way that we run our institutions, in the way that we prioritize perhaps some elements over another. You know, you just said there are ideas that we know don't work, and yet they come back, and they come back, and they come back. And yes, we can think about that happening, you know, at a large scale, at the, you know, at the level of the nation state, but does it also happen at the level of the university? And you know, I was hoping that maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what makes our model different in terms of where we place our priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. Much like in broader society, where someone has a very wrong-headed idea and, you know, advocates for it, convinces others for it, etc. The same thing is true at a university. Professors are individuals. They have a perspective. And we know their perspective cannot be universally true because they disagree with one another. So somebody has to be wrong, right?
Right.
Otherwise, and that's a good thing, right? The way that you promote research, the way you push the frontiers of knowledge is through disagreement, right? People who challenge the status quo, people who are for the status quo, some people who challenge it are incorrect, some people who challenge it are correct, and you have to go and figure that out. Now we confuse that, the role of research university professors to push the frontiers of knowledge with education.
Okay.
Which is presenting your point of view to a group of students that are not equipped to critically evaluate it.
Okay. And that's what creates those little aha moments, right? I remember when I was at the university and I would hear my professors teach, sometimes I would catch some things and sometimes I wouldn't, and sometimes it was like a stroke of luck.
Right.
Oh, I got it.
That's right. There's this phenomenon that was coined by the academic Murray Gell-Mann, who called the Murray Gell-Mann phenomenon, which is when you read a trusted media outlet, and you know, could be in the United States, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, what have you. And every once in a while, you say, oh, this is very interesting, very informed, etc. And then you would read something about your area of expertise. And you would say, my God, this reporter is a terrible reporter. Doesn't understand the core ideas, is, you know, making all sorts of crazy things. And then you would, you know, continue to read the paper, and then maybe you would hit an area that you have a personal hobby in, and you notice, my God, that's a terrible reporter. And then you actually realize, if you step back and think about it, no. Reporters are reporting on a much shallower level. Right. They don't actually provide the full insight because they don't provide you, by and large, with the kind of analysis that an expert would have, because they don't have that expertise.
And that's the asymmetry of knowledge that you're referring to
Exactly.
between research institutions and academics who are based or focused on research and then teaching.
Exactly. And what happens is that the individual, if your job is, if there are 1,000 faculty members at the university offer, or 1,000 different courses, and your job is to pick 30 of them at random, you're going to get 30 perspectives, but you aren't necessarily going to get the tools to evaluate those 30 perspectives.
Okay.
And so what the institution must do, first and foremost, is put together an agreed upon set of tools through which you can evaluate what it is that you will encounter. Then you have to practice evaluating those tools by looking at different perspectives, right? And looking at them and understanding what makes sense and what does not make sense about those perspectives. Mm-hmm. Then you have to think about, how do I create my own perspectives? How do I go through the process of generation myself? And only after you go through repeated instances of that over and over and over again, then at that point can you go and encounter a professor and their point of view, and they will present it to you as fact, and you will say, no, that's actually wrong, and I believe that's wrong, and here is why. Here is my reasoned understanding. Right. And one of the things that I've always told students at Minerva is that I remind them that their professors do not have a Minerva education. And,
interesting.
And that is something that they have to understand. I remember the very first time we implemented a Minerva program at another university. It was at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. We took a small group of students, 20 students, just as an experiment to see what happens. And at the end of the first year, I asked the students, I said, do the professors in your non-Minerva classes that they took in parallel, they took half their classes in Minerva design classes and half in the regular HKUST classes, did they know that you're in this program? They said, oh, everybody knows. We're the only students that sit in the front row. We're the only students who ask questions, and we're the only students who point out the logical fallacies of our professors.
Correct.
And that's during their first year.
Yeah.
That's how powerful
Right.
those tools are.
And interesting, because as you know, we've adopted some of your model as well. And we see exactly the same things. I always tell my facilitators, we don't call them professors here, they're facilitators because they facilitate knowledge or learning. That our students are more, I hate to use the word difficult, but sometimes that's how they're described. But difficult because of what you've just described.
Correct.
Because they sit at the front, because they're not intimidated by figures of power or authority, because we can have first-level world-class thinkers talking to us at our events, and it is my students that always raise their hand, right? That want to ask the questions, that are inquisitive. And I think that's really interesting to see because it happens in that first year as well.
Right.
Right? And so I always think, okay, well there has to be something that we're doing right.
Absolutely. And if you were to shift the university model as we have at Minerva, as you have at Libertad, from being this idea that a professor has full dominion over their course, and that course has nothing to do with any other course, but instead have the professoriate as a whole, the faculty as a whole, the administration, have a philosophy, right, of what are these systems thinking tools, and create a curriculum that is connected, where you introduce a concept in one class that is reinforced in another.
Correct.
Right, where you get assessed and see how broadly a student can apply what it is that they've learned. That is what enables effective teaching of the students, and it brings out the best in each of those professors, not because they profess what it is that they think is true, but as you say, they facilitate that ingestion of systematic thinking.
Right.
And at that point, they can say, well, what do you think about this perspective? What do you think about that perspective? But that facilitation of learning is really the point of a university. And it's sad that universities have so far abandoned that perspective, and it's really the movement that we're at the forefront of, is trying to reform universities to come back to this idea of an institutional perspective, at least in the foundations that you lay for these students, to then allow them to interrogate subject matter or opinion later on.
So I have another question, and this is, I'm thinking about people who might be watching us. You've been in tech, you live in Silicon Valley, you are at the forefront of the evolution of higher education, and we know skills-based learning works, right? But we also know the world is changing with exponential technologies. There are so many changes that we're going to be confronting in the next decades. You have children of your own. Mm-hmm. What skills would you recommend to our audience that you would say are absolutely essential for students to learn, or for our children to learn, to be able to be successful in the next, 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways, many of these skills that are crucial today have always been crucial.
Okay.
It's just that the severity of that need has increased dramatically. We could get away with non-systems education 50 years ago. The world just moved more slowly. There were people who entered a career, and that's the career they spent their whole life in. There wasn't as much mobility. There wasn't as much flux, despite the fact that challenges in the world were significant 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, etc. But the reality is that universities back then were more focused on systems education than they are today. So we had a decline in that kind of education, whereas the need for it and the speed of decision making has increased. And so if I think about what is crucial today, I wish I could boil it down to a small number of things.
Oh, come on, give us the top 5. You can do this.
I'll give you a couple of categories, which I think are absolutely crucial. I think category number 1 is the ability to be able to learn what it is that is presented to you. So that means effective processes of filtering information, understanding what is real and what is not, and being able to incorporate that into your own knowledge basis and ability to look through things. And those are meta-cognitive opportunities or requirements that we do through a very long process of repeating particular elements over and over again, recontextualizing them so you can see common patterns from different subjects. But if there's one area that everybody needs to be able to get, and unfortunately there are components under it, but it is that ability to discern what it is that is real versus not real, potentially true versus almost certainly not true, et cetera, and be able to learn from it and be able to ingest that and incorporate it later on.
I'm always taken by, my colleagues sometimes and my friends who have studied at wonderful institutions, and yet you see a politician implement what is really a charade, a facade of a problem solving, and they can't see it as that.
Yeah.
They can't see that there is no problem that is being solved.
Correct.
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift because we're running out of time.
Sure.
So I'm going to shift to my last question. Minerva University has been ranked the most innovative university in the world in the last 4 years. And recently, the Universidad de Libertad was named the most innovative university in Mexico and the 3rd most innovative in Latin America. Now, for individuals that are not familiar with our model, why do you think that this is so? What have we done differently?
I think fundamentally we've redefined what the concept of education is. In almost every university in the world, including some that are ranked below us but very close to us, the concept of education is very simply, can I demonstrate at a point in time that I've crammed enough information and I have it in short-term memory to be able to pass a test?
And then forget it.
And then forget it immediately.
Right.
And by the way, sometimes if nobody can remember the information, and out of 100 points, the top score is 36, we'll curve the results so 36 becomes an A.
Right.
Right? And if I get 5% correct, that's a C. So, and this isn't made up. This is what happens in universities all over the world every single semester. And so the conception of moving away from a cram, pass, forget model and calling that an education, and this is why I refer to those people previously as credentialed, not educated. They got their credential, they didn't actually get an education.
Right.
And shifting that to an education, to the ability to learn a piece of information or a cognitive tool or a skill in course number 1, and 3 years later be able to be assessed on how effectively you use that tool, and of course all throughout in between, that concept is so revolutionary in formal education, despite the fact that in anything that we educate students on, it's obvious that things that actually we need them to learn. So for example, if you wanted to learn a musical instrument, if you wanted to learn a sport, if you wanted to learn a language,
right.
The idea that you would learn those things by cramming, passing, and forgetting, I'm going to cram my serve. I'm going to show that I can serve correctly in tennis one day, and then I'm going to forget how to serve, but I'm going to be a great tennis player. That's such a ridiculous concept, but it's how our higher education institutions are put together. So bringing that organic way of teaching human beings into a university setting is in and of itself massively innovative. But I think the second part is then what flows from it, the emergent properties. Once you focus your mind and understand that that is the role of education, what are the knock-on effects? Whether it be facilitators as opposed to professors,
Right.
making up your faculty, whether it's the lived environment, right, of where students are, how they experience, how they deploy what it is that they've done through interactions with companies, with their own projects, with startups, etc. Whether it's in Minerva's case where you travel around the world and experience that opportunity and applying it through different culture. The shift and committing of first principles in education to what actually matters and how it matters allows you to then innovate tremendously around different elements of what the education system is. And that creates a great opportunity to demonstrate to the rest of the world that the rigid, monolithic, anti-educational credentialing system that we have, once reformed, can unlock all sorts of other opportunities to further student learning, further their experience, and really further the institution.
If you'll allow me, I'd like to tell you how I came to the Universidad de la Libertad.
Please.
So I graduated from a liberal arts college and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, got a Fulbright scholarship, did that. And then I just continued in academia because I didn't know what to do. And then I went into private industry and had a very interesting career there where I felt I could fulfill my purpose, which has always been to try and help others. And so when I was asked if I would like to be a part of a university again, as we were founding this university, I said, no, you can't make an impact at a university. And then I was explained the model. And I think what I would like to conclude with is really just a very heartfelt thank you. Because I have now returned to academia and feel as though, yes, I am making an impact. And I think that is all thanks to something that you've begun, which is, again, I'm going to just call it the evolution of higher education.
Thank you so much. It really means a lot.
No, thank you, Ben, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Inconformes es producido en la Universidad de la Libertad.